We want a dynamic trade relationship, but we want one that serves American workers and businesses and that's in our interest. And in order for that to happen, there have to be some changes, because U.S. business, in many cases, patience is wearing thin. U.S. business needs to see some action taken to address these issues. Otherwise, they will deem it as just too risky and, as I said, uninvestable. What it is not is decoupling or looking to hold back the Chinese economy.
That was Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo wrapping up her 4-day trip to China yesterday, urging Beijing to take action in addressing the recent raids and fines on U.S. businesses. She also says decoupling from China is not our economic or national security goal in the United States. I spoke with former U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer about this yesterday, and here's where he came out on it. Watch.
We have to have a phased-in, clear policy of strategic decoupling. We have to disentangle our technology so that future technology is not dependent. Our defense industry is dependent on China. And the third part of strategic decoupling has to be outgoing and ingoing investment. It can only be in situations where it helps the United States. It's the capital markets, but it's also these individual investors.
Yeah.
We should have a clear policy where if they invest here, it's in our interest.
Joining me right now is Wisconsin Congressman. He is House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party's chairman, Mike Gallagher. Mr. Chairman, great to see you this morning. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I was just reading your op-ed, and it is an important one. So I want to make sure to raise this right away, because you write in the Washington Post, Americans are unwittingly financing the CCP. It has to stop. Walk us through how we're doing that.
Well, first, let me say that Ambassador Lighthizer is absolutely right. We need to strategically decouple. That was a bipartisan agreement about a year and a half ago, but then the Biden administration decided that was too mean to China. So instead, we're going to diversify or de-risk or whatever the latest D word is. But part of it, no matter where you fall on the decoupling versus de-risking, I think everybody should agree that we shouldn't be allowing American money to flow into Chinese military companies. And that's what's happening, primarily through passive investments, through ETF, through various indexes. Our investigation of BlackRock and MSCI revealed that American money is going to Chinese military companies that are building things like aircraft carriers, fighter jets, artillery shells, advanced nuclear technology. Incredibly, this is not illegal, but it is in some meaningful sense suicidal, because we're subsidizing our own destruction. We need to stop the flow of U.S. capital to companies that are building things designed to kill Americans in a future conflict, or maybe pointed at Americans right now in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this now for several years, because I've been pointing out the thrift fund, which, of course, is the 401k for government employees. How insane is it that government employees, including military, are actually, enabled to invest in Chinese military and in enlarging their military? Right now, they've got a larger Navy than the United States does. But I want you to talk a little about this idea of decoupling. How do you view this, Congressman, in terms of the risks to America? We know how dependent the U.S. is on China. We know all of those supply chains, that we actually have to rely on the Chinese Communist Party to get the underlying active ingredients for our prescription drugs. So decoupling, what does that mean in terms of the risk, the threat to America, at least over the short term?
Well, imagine if we did find ourselves in a kinetic confrontation with China over, say, Taiwan. Let's say Xi Jinping tried to invade Taiwan. Well, the Chinese Communist Party could decide to cut off the export of advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, as indeed they threatened to do at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. So when Americans' access to life-saving drugs is threatened, things are going to get very tricky very quickly. So strategic decoupling is in our interest in order to reduce the coercive economic leverage that the CCP could wield in order to bring us to our knees. Now, it has to be selective. We have to identify the areas where clearly we can't afford to be dependent on China. We're going to have some economic relationship going forward, but that's why it's imperative. And I just would say to the business community, which really resists this idea, in addition to being morally reprehensible, some of these investments in China have just been terrible investments. You know, if you look at just the last 5 years, the S&P 500 has soared 78%, but BlackRock's FXI ETF, which invests in some of these large cap Chinese companies, is down 30% in that same time period, even as Chinese GDP supposedly doubled. So Where did the money go? Why did it evaporate? We just need to look at the risks, honestly assess the risks of doing business in China in addition to strategically decoupling.
It's such a great point, really important. Does BlackRock get this? Why is BlackRock continuing to double down on investing in China?
Well, we're hoping to get a fulsome response to the letter that we sent them and MSCI and see their point of view. What I don't understand is why you would have companies in various indexes that are on a government blacklist. I mean, that should just be an easy no-brainer. Even if we disagree about the broader issues of decoupling, don't have a Chinese military company or anything related to the Chinese military in one of your indexes. That should just be an easy area where we can clean up our system right now.
But doesn't this start from the top? This starts with the Biden administration. I mean, I put this to Jamie Dimon a couple of years ago, the CEO and chairman of J.P. Morgan, and I said to him, why, you're Jamie Dimon. You should not. You're making a statement by investing and doubling down in China. And he said, look, Maria, we're going to follow the law. The law is the law. If we are allowed to invest and try to sell our wares to 1.4 billion people, we're going to do it. So doesn't this start at the top? And yet you have Gina Raimondo over there at the podium in Beijing saying, things have got to change. I'm sure the Chinese are shaking in their boots after that speech. In the meantime, Meta just announced it shut down what's being called the largest known online covert influence operation in the world. Meta announced it removed more than 7,700 Facebook and Instagram accounts linked to Chinese law enforcement. The campaign was aimed at advancing China's interests, discrediting adversaries. This operation impacted more than 50 apps dating back to 2019, Congressman. So how come we're not seeing any response from the administration? Does this not start at the top?
It does, but Biden is trying to revive diplomatic and economic engagement with China as the core pillar of his strategy, despite this approach having failed for over 2 decades. Perhaps it's an effort just to cool temperatures going into the election. He doesn't want to see any economic downturn, or certainly doesn't. They're constantly afraid of provoking the Chinese Communist Party, forgetting that Marxist-Leninist regimes view concessions like this as appeasement and actually get more aggressive, and we need to maintain the economic and diplomatic and conventional military pressure on them. One point on the Meta story. So this is what the Chinese were trying to do via Meta, but imagine the influence that they already have via a CCP-controlled app like TikTok. This should open our eyes to the danger of allowing TikTok to become even more dominant, perhaps the most dominant media platform in the country. And I know certain legislators are afraid to do anything on this issue, but we have to step up on both these issues. We have to put controls and guardrails on U.S. capital going to China, as well as figure out how to prevent TikTok, a CCP-controlled app, from becoming the dominant media company in America.
Well, what was the recent executive order too narrow? Because the Biden administration tries to act like it's doing something, but everyone I've spoken with said that executive order recently limiting some investments in tech doesn't go far enough. It doesn't start for a whole year, and it's ineffective. Why?
It has at least 2 problems, Maria. One is it puts Treasury in the lead with a lot of off-ramps and exceptions. And as you know, Treasury is historically and famously dovish on China, so that doesn't give a lot of confidence. The second thing is it tackles only active private investments, so venture capital, private equity. That's about 17% of the total problem. The overwhelming majority of this is public investment or passive investment. So if you don't address that issue, you're really not solving the problem. And that's what we need to address via legislation that will last beyond this administration. We in Congress need to step up and legislate a lasting solution to this issue so that we don't continue to subsidize our own destruction.
And you are stepping up, and we appreciate your leadership, Congressman. Thanks so much.